So if you're heading to an interview and you've got the jitters, the first thing to say here is don't stress. That's completely normal. The trick is just learning to manage those jitters as you go through your interviews. And in this video, I'm going to share with you 6 tips that I've used to successfully coach literally hundreds of people through the interview process who ultimately received offers. And the first 2 tips here relate to mindset. And the first tip is just on the word interview itself. When people hear the word interview, understandably, this evokes feelings of stress and frustration and just pain, and I want to flip that and reframe it. So when you're in an interview, instead of thinking of it as an interview, I would think of it instead as a conversation, because that's what it is. You're talking to someone who is likely a future colleague of yours. You'll have very normal conversations with in the future. And if it's someone who's a little bit more senior, just think about them as someone who's just you fast forward into the future a few years. They're not superhumans. They're just there to have a conversation with you. And if you take that conversation mindset and approach with you, I think you're going to find a lot less stress from front to back. Then moving on to the second point, which again is about mindset, there are broadly speaking 2 ways to think about the interview process, and particularly a single interview. So the first approach is this is make or break. If I don't get this job, it's going to be a mess. My life is over and it's going to be a disaster. And even if that were true, which it usually isn't, that mindset is just very counterproductive. Instead, what I would encourage is a mindset that's much more like you're playing a game of tennis. So a game-like mindset. And I personally didn't play tennis, but if you bring this mindset in, I promise you it's more productive. So if you imagine a game of tennis, someone's going to come in and they're going to swat balls at you. And you're going to try to swat the ball back. And in certain instances, you're not going to hit the ball. So the big point to make here is just that, which is you're not going to hit all the balls. And when the balls come at you and you miss them, the important thing is reacting positively and saying, okay, I missed this ball. I'm going to pick it back up and swat it over the net. And in an interview, you're literally having proverbial balls swatted at you throughout the interview process, and you just have to learn how to react to them. So you don't slam down the racket. You pick the ball back up, swat it back over, and then move on with the match. That's really the mindset you want to carry with you throughout this interview process. And so stepping back here, this is really just a big game that you're playing, and we're going to carry this game metaphor through the remaining steps. Now, moving on to step 3, we have what is debatably the easiest step of all these, and I would argue one of the most important, which is just simply smiling. So when you walk into an interview, you should be smiling from the start of the interview to the end of the interview. And you can see that as I'm saying this, I can't help, I just start smiling. So when people smile, it's infectious, and this helps you on a few different levels. So for you as an interviewee, it's going to help you biochemically. You're going to feel better. You will actually project more confidence from yourself, regardless of how you're feeling, by virtue of smiling. And to that last point there on projecting confidence, there's another factor that really matters here, which is signaling in this game of interviewing. So when you're interviewing, a big part of what you're doing is conveying your skills, but another thing you're doing is conveying how you'll interact with people. And you want to signal to the other side that when something is thrown at you, you know how to react and you're going to react to it with confidence. And in a sense, smiling is a hack to fake confidence. So if you think about what an unconfident person looks like, they're probably not smiling. So you need to smile from front to back in your interviews. Then moving on to item number 4 here, we have what I call the energy wall. And I want you to imagine a clear wall between you and the interviewer in the interview room with a one-way pass through where your energy flows through and their energy does not flow back to you. And the reason this is important is when we go into interviews, we typically don't know the person who's sitting on the other side of the table, or at least we don't know them very well. And that person might have a default mode that's very grumpy. It might be very smiley. They might have just had a bad day. They might have just had a great day. And we have no idea how they operate in general in most cases, and you don't want to try to read them. Instead, what you should be doing is going into the interview and bringing positive, not over the top, but positive energy from front to back. If someone's not interested, not excited, or maybe they're throwing tough things at you, you're just sending positive energy through to them and not reacting to their energy one way or another. I have lost count at this point of the number of folks who've come back to me after a tough interview. And I've actually had this happen to myself as well, where you go through an interview and you get a lot of grilling and people are pushing you and you walk out and you say, man, I'm never getting that job and they hate me. And then 30 minutes later, you get the offer because they were just stress testing you. And so to wrap this up, when you're in your interviews, don't try to read the other side and just bring your positive energy and let that energy flow to the interviewer. Then moving on here, we have 2 final steps, which are really built around dealing with tough questions. And before I even get into those steps, it's important to understand that in an interview, you're going to get tough questions at some point, and that's okay. We have to acknowledge that and we have to learn how to just deal with them. So step number 5 here is the first part of dealing with tough questions, which is when you get a tough question, there are really two ways to respond. The first is the deer in headlights approach, where your eyes get big and you say, you kind of convey to the other side, I just don't know. Or alternatively, what I would argue is much more effective is just seeming interested in the question. So for me, this is going to be like a chin scratch and I'm going to look down. Some people might look up the ceiling. Some people might look a little bit left. But regardless of how you do it, what you want to do is to signal to the other side that you're not afraid of their question and that you're going to try it. Now, it's important to note that you don't have to have the answer at this point, but rather what you're doing here is just really buying yourself a little bit of space to really think through the problem and the path to an answer. And that leads to the final step, step 6, which is buying yourself time. So if you've seemed interested and you still don't know the answer, what we're going to do in this last step, which is really 2 pieces in one, is repeat the question back to the interviewer. So if someone asks me a question, I'm going to say, so what you're saying is, repeat the question, and then say, I just want to make sure that that's the right question and I'm thinking through this correctly, just so that you, again, give yourself time to background process. And again, you may still not have the answer or the right path to getting to an answer. At that point, what you want to do is start poking at the question with questions in the form of a statement. So as an example of this, if you are given a brain teaser, and this is a silly brain teaser, but if you were given a brain teaser where they asked how many pumpkins can fit in a 747, I would start with something like, so I'm going to assume that pumpkins are, X wide and Y tall. I'm just giving the dimensions of the pumpkins. And what I'm doing is asking questions, but in the form of a statement. So again, it's something like, I'm going to assume it's X wide and Y tall. Just want to make sure that I'm thinking about this correctly. And what this again does is it buys you time to answer the question. So now that we've covered everything in detail, I want to step back and recap all the big points that we've covered here. So to begin with, this is a conversation, not an interview. It's a game where you're going to make mistakes, and that's completely fine. The trick is just picking the ball back up and swatting it back over the net. Beyond that, you have to smile from front to back. And then beyond that, if we have an interviewer that's a little bit negative or a little bit grumpy, we're not receiving that energy. Rather, we're just sending our positive energy their way. From there, when we get tough questions, we're going to seem interested regardless of what's thrown at us. And if we still don't know the answer, we're going to repeat the question back. And then we're going to poke at the question with questions in the form of statements, all to buy us time in the interview. And I promise you that if you follow these steps, you're going to find the entire interview process and flow just much more manageable and, God forbid, maybe even a little bit enjoyable. With that all laid out, I wish you the best of luck in your interviews, and I'd love to hear any success stories you have. Please reach out and let me know here in the comments.